Yn aine manachar agus an Vic agus an Spirit Neve. Amen. Fáilte here to the cathedral in Letterkenny. Rather, thank you for welcoming me into your home or into your space today. From yesterday, I want us to remember, fundamentally, we are called, each one of us, to a personal encounter with Jesus, and we are commissioned as missionary disciples. And that's fundamental. Today, there is an idea that I think is key to Pope Francis, and that is the idea of a contemplative gaze. And it will come through our consideration of the world we live in today. It comes from St. Ignatius has this idea in the spiritual exercises before the incarnation of the three divine persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, looking down on the world and seeing a world in terrible need, in sin and rebellion and misery. They looked on it with compassion and they decided to send the Son to be a part of it. Okay? That whole movement came out of the contemplative gaze of God on the world. Okay, so now, looking at this time in history, Pope Francis says this: in our time, humanity is experiencing a turning point in its history, as we can see from the advances being made in many fields. We can only praise the steps being taken to improve people's welfare in areas like healthcare, education, and communications. At the same time, we have to remember that the majority of our contemporaries are barely living from day to day with dire consequences. A number of diseases are spreading. The hearts of many people are gripped by fear and desperation, even in the so-called rich countries. The joy of living frequently fades. Lack of respect for others and violence are on the rise, and inequality is increasingly evident. It is a struggle to live, and often to live with precious little dignity. Pope Francis wrote that 7 years ago in 2013, and yet somehow or other it rings very true, maybe even more true for us today. So the Blessed Trinity, looking down on the world, decided to send the Son to save us. And now they look down on the world. They look down on our world today, and they decide to send you and me as missionary disciples to evangelize the world. When we see the world with the eyes of God, Francis will say, there are some things to which we will say no. No, he says, to an economy of exclusion. Remember, Pope Francis comes from Latin America, where he saw up close the existence of great wealth and terrible, dire third world poverty. And he said, to sustain a lifestyle that is prepared to live with that sort of inequality that excludes others, he says, a globalization of indifference has developed. An economy that tolerates exclusion and inequality kills. And I think Francis would say, in many ways, we are a part of that. Remember, very early on in his pontificate, around the time he wrote this letter, he flew to Lampedusa, the little Italian island where there were already droves of refugees who had come in leaky boats in their thousands, and many hundreds had already died in the Mediterranean Sea. Francis sees that, an economy, a world economy that tolerates that as an economy of exclusion. And he says, almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the cry of the poor, incapable of weeping for other people's pain and feeling a need to help them as though this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity, he says, the culture of prosperity deadens us We're thrilled if the market offers us something new to buy. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem like a mere spectacle. They fail to move us. One cause of this situation is found, he says, in our relationship with money. We calmly accept its dominion over ourselves and our societies. I would say here, right in this current situation in which we live, what is it saying to us about the rat race that we have all been a part of to some extent? Is there anything about the way we have been? I shop, therefore I am. Is there something about the way we have been that we now realize we would like to be different? No to the idolatry of money, he would say. Then there's indifference and relativism. In many ways, he says, the problem is more for many people that of a widespread indifference and relativism. In Ireland, we've seen this in a big way in recent years, where there's been a rejection of any authority, particularly in the church, particularly the authority of the church, that would speak of right and wrong. Francis says, the process of secularization tends to reduce the faith and the church to the sphere of the private and personal. Furthermore, by completely rejecting the transcendent, it has produced a growing deterioration of ethics, a weakening of the sense of personal and collective sin, and a steady increase in relativism. These have led to a general sense of disorientation, especially in the periods of adolescence and young adulthood, which are so vulnerable to change. Adolescence and young adulthood. What sort of world do we really want for our children? Francis would say, and it is true, true joy can only come out of living from real values. So there are things that when we look on the world with a contemplative gaze of God, to which we must say no. To what do we say yes? When the three divine persons look down right now on our towns and cities, what do they see that gives them delight? How do they want us to evangelize the culture in which we live? We're living through a fascinating moment right now. Here in Donegal, for example, just let's take here. We're in the middle of an unprecedented crisis. If we look around the county, we see many people standing up and being counted. Christian values are being spoken about constantly. We hear about people who are ready to make self-sacrifice, people involved in community service and love of neighbour. 50 years ago, the leadership in all of this would have been given by bishops and priests and explicitly committed lay people. And that is not the case right now. Of course, bishops and priests and committed lay people are involved, but something has changed. What does a contemplative gaze, that is, the gaze of God looking down on all of this, what does it see? How is the Holy Spirit working in this moment? How do we, as people, you and I, as people whose primary relationship is this personal encounter with Jesus, how are we called to support and build the kingdom in this new situation? We're challenged in many ways. We think of essential services these days. Who are the people who are essential? Very often they're not the people who earn the big money. The people who are essential, we suddenly realize, as well as, of course, the people in the medical service and the carers and so on, they are also the people who clean the hospital, the people who stack the shelves in our grocery stores, the people who make sure that the food gets to us when it might not. We're invited to a whole new understanding of what is essential. In the middle of that, what is the gospel saying? Where is the Holy Spirit at work in this? And what role do we, the committed missionary disciples of Jesus, the people whose privilege is to have a personal encounter with Jesus, what are we saying to this? What are we called to say to it? How are we called to understand it? Francis has a big thing in the second chapter that I'm thinking of today about our cities. In a certain sense, we all live in cities. When your children or your grandchildren go upstairs onto their phones, they live in a city. Even if they live 5 miles from the nearest house, they're part of New York City. Francis says we cannot ignore the fact that in cities, human trafficking, the narcotics trade, the abuse and exploitation of minors, the abandonment of the elderly and the infirm, and various corruption and criminal activity take place. At the same time, what could be significant places of encounter and solidarity often become places of isolation and mutual distrust. Houses and neighbourhoods are more often built to isolate and protect than to connect and integrate. What is called for is an evangelization capable of shedding light on the new ways of relating to God, to others, and to the world around us that are a part of our modern reality, whether we like it or not. And this inspiring essential values. The gospel must reach the places where new ways of being, new narratives, new paradigms are being formed, bringing the word of Jesus to the inmost soul of our cities. The inmost soul of our cities is the inmost soul of our county here in Donegal. There are all kinds of challenges, all kinds of challenges. And Francis says there is a big no to a sterile pessimism. One of the most serious temptations which stifles boldness and zeal is a defeatism that turns us into querulous and disillusioned pessimists, sourpusses. Nobody can go off to battle unless he is fully convinced of victory beforehand. If we start without confidence, we have already lost half the battle and we bury our talents. While painfully aware of our own frailties, we have to march on without giving in, keeping in mind what the Lord said to St. Paul, "My grace is enough for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." The joy of the gospel is such that it cannot be taken away from us by anyone or anything. The evils of our world and those of the church must not be excuses for diminishing our commitment and our fervour. Let us look upon them as challenges which can help us to grow. Our faith, he says, is challenged to discern how wine can come from water and how wheat can grow in the midst of weeds. This call to be missionary disciples, personal encounter with Jesus, is meant to go on not somewhere away on the sidelines. It's meant to go on in the middle of the big modern world of which we are a part, which has so many terrible challenges. But because we are missionary disciples with a personal encounter with Jesus, we are invited to have this contemplative gaze that looks on the world through the eyes of the Blessed Trinity, that looks on the world with all its challenges, with the same love and compassion that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit look on the world with. So today, I invite you to stay with some ideas. Use your imagination. Imagine the three divine persons looking down on your life in this moment of coronavirus, and they look down on your life with love and compassion, what do they see that they want you to do differently? What do they see that they want to encourage? That's one. Secondly, when you look at our contemporary society with the contemplative gaze of a missionary disciple, what are you called upon to challenge? And what are you called upon to support and encourage? Stay with those. Please stay with that contemplative, the gaze of God, and then enter into the gaze of God yourself and look at our world and ask those questions. God bless you. Amen. San Vic, San Spirit Neve. Amen.